We are in Psalms. This is our last Sunday in the Psalms before we begin actually a series in Nehemiah this fall. But we're in Psalm 56. Psalm 56. And I heard this week that there's an inverse correlation between anxiety and creativity, which is to say that when anxiety goes like this, creativity goes like that, right? It's hard to be hopeful for the present or for the future when you are full of fear, right? It's hard to have ideas of creative ideas of what to do now and what to do then when it just feels like everything is coming apart. And when fear is high, hope is low. And creativity is low. Listen to this. In 2022, we've seen the release, and I need to read all these because there's so many that I didn't even include, but I'm not going to remember all these. 2022 alone, we've seen the release of The Ice Age Adventures of Buck Wild, Hotel Transylvania Transformania. That's a sequel, for those of you who are aware of that. Scream 5, and the producer says Scream 6 is on its way. Tyler Perry's The Medea Homecoming, Tall Girl 2, Fortress, Sniper's Eye, Fantastic Beasts, The Secret of Dumbledore, Top Gun Maverick, Downton Abbey, A New Era, Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, Beavis and Butthead Do the Universe, Jurassic World Dominion, Thor, Love and Thunder, Minions, The Rise of Gru. And I'm telling you, I could keep going. And those are the ones that have already been released. You probably know, and you're probably really excited. In September, Spider-Man No Way Home is coming out. And in December, Avatar The Way of Water is coming out. And there are more and more that are being released. And all of these are seconds or thirds or fifths or sixths or the Marvel movies. Does anybody know how many Marvel movies there are in existence now? I don't know if anyone knows the answer to that. I'm sort of tired just of reading all of those. But it begs the question, where's the creativity? Where's the creativity in our movies and in our stories? Where's it gone? That we have to just sort of rehash, continue on some story that made a bunch of money. Well, let's just keep going with that. You all probably know that in the last 2.5 years, there are 605 million people that got COVID in 288 countries. 605 million people got COVID. 6.5 million deaths were attributed to COVID in the last 2.5 years. I'm guessing I'm not the only one that read this. There was a huge study that was done in April and May in the UK. It studied 1.25 million people in the UK that had gotten COVID and 1.25 million people that didn't get COVID, but they got another respiratory illness over the last 2.5 years. What that study found was that elderly people were far more likely to have a stroke and have early dementia if you had COVID than if you didn't. If you were from the age of 18 to the age of 45, you're far more likely to have dementia, constant brain fog, and other mental issues if you had COVID than if you didn't. And this is actually one of the more scary statistics that I read, and that's that children, meaning under 18, if you had COVID, you are 2 times more likely to have epilepsies than if you didn't have COVID. I mean, we have actually just been experiencing sort of a prolonged natural disaster, whether or not you think it comes from some lab in Wuhan or not. It's a natural disaster that's affected our entire world. And now there's monkeypox. And of course there's inflation, and inflation isn't like a US thing. I actually learned this week that McDonald's in Australia is now putting cabbage, which I love cabbage. I'm like totally a fan of the whole cabbage and pork thing on New Year's. But they're putting cabbage on burgers instead of lettuce because a head of lettuce right now in Australia is pushing $10. I mean, inflation is just affecting everyone globally. And there's huge global conflict. In fact, some people are saying that we're experiencing a more significant global sort of superpower conflicts than we have in over a generation, really since the fall of the Soviet Union, with the rise, of course, of Russia, the invading Ukraine, but also, the U.S. itself is, putting battleships in the strait between Taiwan and China. And we're all kind of like, what's happening? Of course, you've probably heard this too. And it sort of, I don't even know that I need to share this because you all probably know this. But anxiety and depression globally are up 25% in the last 2.5 years. That's a global statistic. Anxiety and depression are up 25% in the last 2.5 years. No wonder Marvel just keeps on putting out the same thing, right? Of course creativity is down because fear and anxiety, depression are way up. And David says in this psalm, phrases like this: what can flesh do to me? What can man do to me? And we all sort of want to reply like this: hey, David, hold my beer. Let me tell you, because they can do an awful lot. Or we want to say this: hey, David, it's easy enough for you to say, weren't you the greatest king ever in Israel? I mean, didn't you just have people like waiting on you and stuff? Do you live in the same world that we live in? But David, the author of this psalm, which is a song and a prayer, it's directed Godward. He does not need to do this. He doesn't need to hold our beer. We do not need to lecture him because he knows full well the dynamics of this life. He knows full well the fear that can be thrown at you in this life. I mean, think about this. David was the man after God's own heart. He devoted himself to knowing the scriptures of the Lord. He knew that Cain killed Abel. He knew that Dinah was raped by Shechem. He knew that Potiphar's wife solicited, propositioned Joseph, and that Joseph lost his job and was thrown in prison because of that. He knew all these kinds of things. He knew that Israel, the very people of God, spent 400 years in slavery to the pharaohs down in Egypt. He knew all this stuff. And so you can't say that the reality of fear in the world is lost on David. But what I want you to also see is that he didn't just know this sort of in the stories. You know, the stories of old when the people were in slavery. Oh, back when in Cain and Abel. This is not an abstract kind of thing for David. This was an experiential thing. David knew fear. And that's what I want you to see first, is that David doesn't actually, he's not sort of walking above it all. And not only is he not walking above it all, but he doesn't name it as something other than what it is. He says, this is fearful. Listen, verse 1 and 2. Be gracious to me, O God, for man tramples on me. All day long an attacker oppresses me. My enemies trample on me all day long, for many attack me proudly. I mean, he's not just saying this is a story of old, but this is my experience now. In fact, it almost seems as though what David is saying is, people are beating me even when I'm down. Did you notice it says trample twice? Oppress, attack, trample. If you go down to verse 5, it says this. All day long, which was said in verse 1 and verse 2. All day long they injure my cause. All their thoughts are against me for evil. They stir up strife. They lurk. They watch my steps as they have waited for my life. For their crime, will they escape? In wrath, cast down the peoples, O God. So he goes from saying, they beat me when I'm down, but it almost sounds here as though they even beat him when he's up. He seems to be doing fine. He's walking around, and it's sort of like Jesus with these scribes and these Pharisees. They're lurking, looking for how they might catch him. Describe this last section, 5 and 6 and 7. They're describing people who want to say, hey, you're doing something well, but if you slip up just a little bit, you're going down. Maybe you can think of this like this. I worked for the City of Seattle Parks Department in the summertime during college. It was a great job. Most of the time was spent in Lincoln Park, which is a 130-acre park right on the Puget Sound. It's wonderful job, and I loved Timey, who I worked with. This other guy, Phil, that I worked with, I also really liked. He and I would have great conversations about faith and stuff. He was a Harley guy who always, every day, wore a Harley shirt. It's like, Hard Rock Cafe. It's like, how many Hard Rock Cafe t-shirts can you have? How many Harley shirts can you have? Phil had all of them. But Phil multiple times told me, hey, Peter, stop working so hard because you're making me look bad. He was looking out for me. Even when I was trying to do something well, he says, I'm going to take you. You don't do that. Or you think of the neighbor who's just kind of lurking. Are you going to misstep? Because I'm going to get you if you do. The boss who really doesn't want to give you a promotion. He doesn't want to pay you more. And so he's writing down any reason he possibly can find to not do that. This is the experience of David. He's getting trampled on when he's down. He's being lurked and sort of sought after to see what could possibly be wrong when he's up. And it's into this context that David actually does say this, verse 3, when I'm afraid. So it's not the case that David doesn't experience fear or the same experiences that we have that cause us to go, wait, am I going to lose my job if I do this? Or what's going on here? Why is the world like this? David says, when I'm afraid, he names it before the Lord. It's not abstract. It's not just some figment of his imagination, but it's the real lived experience of his life. Now, I want you to know this, okay? If you've been here this last month, what you've seen actually is two different Psalms that have actually given us glimpses into the life of David and this sort of time period of his life that this Psalm is talking about. Psalm 52 and Psalm 54. And Psalm 56, again, gives us a header. In fact, in the Hebrew, that's normally verse 1. A psalm that has a header is normally verse 1, and then as we have verse 1, they have verse 2. But this is what this little header tells us is happening in the life of David. It says this, to the choir master, according to the dove of far-off terebinths. That's probably a tune title, and we don't know what that sounds like, but it was titled that, the dove on far-off terebinths. A miktam of David. That was probably a style, a style of playing. But then it says this, when the Philistines seized him in Gath. Now, I know that that's probably like, a couple weeks ago when we looked at the Ziphites, and you're like, Gath? I don't know what you're talking about when they seized him in Gath. Well, that's why I'm here. I'm going to tell you the story. Okay, so when we looked at Psalm 52, what we saw was that David had to flee for his life from Saul, right? And when he fled from his life from Saul, he fled to the town of Nob, and he went and met there with Ahimelech, who was the high priest. And Ahimelech gave him the bread that was before in the temple there. And he also gave him Goliath's sword. And what we learned after that, right, was that Obed the Edomite betrayed David, and he actually went and he killed all the people, the priests who lived in Nob, and all of their families, their wives and their children and everybody, and the high priest Ahimelech. And then we actually considered the events that happened after that, when David went and he actually protected this town of the Philistines, and they betrayed him, and he went to the Ziphites, and they betrayed him, and he's just getting betrayed by everybody at that time. And there's a couple things that happened between those two stories, the stories of Psalm 52 and the stories of Psalm 54. And one of those things is when this psalm was written. Okay, between those two events, the first thing that happens is that when David actually flees from Nob, he flees to Gath. And Gath was this protected, walled city of the Philistines. And so maybe it makes some sense that he might go there. I'm going to get into that in a bit. But the second thing that happens actually after he leaves Gath is that he goes into the cave of Adullam, and there he's actually met by his brothers, and he's met by other people that join his cause. This story and this psalm is written in the context of fleeing to Gath. Here's what I want you to hear. He's going to a place where he's seeking safety, but where he's seized by the Philistines. And you need to know a couple things to understand this psalm. First thing that you need to know is that David is totally alone. David's totally alone. When I picture David, I picture stories of him taking the Ark of the Covenant and dancing before the people of the Lord up into Zion, right? And there's all these people around him. Or when I picture David, I picture David facing Goliath with the entire Israelite army behind him. When I picture David, I picture him on the throne with servants and all this kind of stuff. That's not the David right here. David is completely alone. He's going to flee to this town all by himself. The second thing that you need to know to understand this is that David is totally desperate. Of what nationality was that big giant that he killed, right? He was the Philistine, all right? What sword was he carrying that Ahimelech had just given him? Goliath's sword, right? And Goliath was a Philistine. Does anybody know how big Goliath likely was? Yeah, 8 to 9 feet tall is the belief, right? 8 to 9 feet tall. We don't totally know how to measure some of the measurements that are in the Bible, but it's 8 to 9 feet. I'm 5'10" on a good day, and how big is a sword of Goliath? I don't know how big it is, but I guarantee it's like it's a big one, right? It's not something that you're like, let me hide this in my cloak, like a Robin Hood kind of sword. It's not like that. Okay, and David is going to a town, Gath, that is a Philistine town with the sword of Goliath, the Philistine, that he can't hide. David's either crazy or he's just totally desperate. He's completely desperate. The third thing that you need to hear, and you need to hear this again, and I'm going to show you how this is said again, is that David was afraid. I mean, David was fleeing for his life, both from Saul. He was fleeing his life from having been aided by Ahimelech the high priest, and he is fleeing into a place where he is not welcomed. He is deeply afraid, and one of the things that we actually hear about when we read that story that Jonathan read for us from 1 Samuel chapter 21, in verse 12 it says this, "And David took these words to heart and was much afraid." Okay, what I'm trying to instill in you here is that David knows fear. And it's not an abstract fear, it's a lived life experience kind of fear. It's the same sort of dynamic that you live in. You might not be fleeing, of course, for your life, but you know fear, and David knows it completely and experientially. He knows isolation. He knows the experience of feeling completely alone. There's nobody that's going with him in this experience. He knows the experience of desperation. What else can I do? I have nothing else that I can do. I might as well actually go and try to see if one of my enemies whose hero I killed and whose sword I have, they might help me. He's in despair. He knows desperation. And he knows fear. He experiences having to flee from his own people. He's experienced betrayal and he's experienced abandonment. He's experienced even his successes being used against him. That's actually part of what happens in that little jig almost that's read for us in 1 Samuel 21. Saul has struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s. It's his actual successes that are being used against him in the town of Gath there. And this psalm is a psalm that's directed Godward, as all the psalms are. They're prayers, they're songs. They're all of our life that's being brought to God and saying, God, here I am. Here's what I'm experiencing. Help. Be with me. So he doesn't hide this fear, but he voices it, and he voices it to the Lord. Now, one of the very real things that happens in a context of deep anxiety or depression, fear, one of the things that often happens, and many of you no doubt know this, is a move towards isolation. It's just one of those deep things that always happens in that. You move away. You often move in the context of fear and anxiety and depression, you start to move away from others. David actually says, you might remember this in Psalm 13, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? And he says, how long must I take counsel in the night and wet my bed with tears? Because of the absence of God, he's isolated in his own bed. So David knows that. And a lot of you know that. You know that you move towards isolation in the context of fear and anxiety and depression. But it's in this place where David is alone and he's in desperation and he's full of fear that he says, Lord, I may be completely alone, but you are with me. I'm voicing this to you. And you're the only one that deeply and completely matters because you never leave me, you never forsake me. And so when David actually voices, Lord, I'm full of fear, well, this is the next thing he says, verse 3. When I'm afraid, I put my trust in you. In God, whose word I praise, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. And it's in that context that then David says, what can flesh do to me? It's not that he's saying flesh can't do anything to me. You can't just take that little phrase and say they can't do anything. He says, what can they do to me in the context of you being present with me? In my isolation and my loneliness, not being the real, actual experience because you are present. Verse 8, it says this, you've kept count of my tossings. Put my tears in your bottle. Let me read that phrase again. This is what the Lord does for our tears. You put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book? Then my enemies will turn back in the day when I call. This I know, that God is for me. In God whose word I praise, in the Lord whose word I praise. In God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? You see, there's that phrase again, but it's in this context of God's presence with him. If God is for you, who can be against you? No one. No one. If God is with you, what fear can overcome you? It cannot. If God knows each one of your tossings at night, the restlessness that keeps you up, if it's true that, as the psalm says, that he counts each one of them, if that's true, won't God always be present with you? If the Lord bottles up your tears, which is to say not one of them is lost on him. You've never cried and the Lord has not seen it and taken note of it and will care for it and deal with it. You've never cried and the Lord has not known it. If God knows and he remembers and it says, as it says, it recounts them, will he not come to your aid? He will. He will. This is the promise of the good news of the gospel, that nothing is lost from our Lord, and he will come to your aid. So what can flesh do to you? What can man do to me? Of course, part of what we say is all kinds of things, and David knew that. He knew it. But if God is for us, the consistent thing in the Bible is nothing can be against us. Nothing can be against us. Maybe you know this, but after Russia invaded Ukraine, NPR tweeted out a bunch of these initial images, and they were disturbing images. Of course, they were images of war. And so they put a disclaimer on this tweet saying, if this disturbs you too much, do not forget to do some self-care. Well, that post got a lot of pushback because Twitter is a global app. And all kinds of folk in Ukraine are reading that, and they're saying, self-care? While I'm hiding? While bombs are going off around me? You think I can just kind of take a break for a day? Go to the spa? Take a long nap? And they got all kinds of pushback for that. And they tweeted back things like this: we don't have that luxury right now. part of the encouragement that I received from our gathering that happened in June, our denominational gathering of ministers and elders, was from the stay clerk's report. The stay clerk is sort of the main officer of our denomination that runs our administrative offices, who is now Brian Chappell, who was actually the president of my seminary and taught my preaching classes. But he was giving this report, and among many other things, he reported how missionaries in Mission to the World, the missions agency of this denomination, were staying in Ukraine after the invasion. And they were helping people actually get out that needed to get out, but they were also helping creatively think with local pastors, how do we get aid in? What they weren't doing is just saying, this is so fearful, and the thing that I need to do right now is isolate and go to the spa and freak out by myself. What they were instead doing is thinking creatively in this situation that they were finding themselves in that was absolutely full of fear. How do they do that? They do that because there's a hope beyond the present experience that God will meet. Their present fear was not the end of all that they could see, but because God was with them, they had hope beyond the present. In 2018, this is the latest stat that I read, Harrisburg High School had a 4-year graduation rate of 49.9%, which, if you do the math, is 0.1% less than 50%, which is to say that if you were going to Harrisburg High School, at least in 2018, you were more likely not to graduate in 4 years than you were to graduate in 4 years. What do you do with that? Well, I think part of what you do with that is Christians get together and go, you know what, we got a bunch of educators in our church, and we got this big old building. Maybe we can help start something that might help people learn how to read and write and do math well and get them on a good foundation for success educationally. If you don't get that, I'm referring to Logos Academy, who now has 50 kids in their preschool through 3rd grade, and they're hoping to add a couple more grades, as the years progress. Well, how do you do that when you have those kinds of statistics? What you could do is just throw up your arms and say, there's nothing that can be done here. This is a failing system. Like, let the whole state just take it over. Go into receivership, blah, 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 blah. Or you can think, you know what? God might actually work if we kind of get up and do something and say, hey, let's think creatively together because we are people who have hope that tomorrow doesn't have to be like today. Think with me of some of our missionaries who this church has supported over the years who have gone to places where they could get killed for being a Christian and thought, you know what? People need better medical education here. They do. And we have that ability, and we can go into that place even though it might mean our lives because we believe that God is actually able to do something beyond the situation of today. Or think of David in Gath. David is incredibly creative. Did he just freeze and go like, oh, you got me with the huge sword. I don't know what to do. No. Actually, and I love how Jonathan read this because he helped you to see the spittle coming down the beard a little bit with his hand like this. What he does is he fakes insanity. David is incredibly creative. I mean, really, this is what happens, okay? Verse 12, and David took these words to heart and was much afraid. He's fearful of Achish, the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior before them and pretended to be insane in their hands and made marks on the doors of the gate and let the spittle run down his beard. That's creativity. I mean, that's David going, you know what? God might show up and do something, and I might have a tomorrow when right now it seems like today's the end. In fact, if we kept reading, it would say this. Then Achish said to his servants, behold, you see this man is mad? Why then have you brought him to me? Do I lack mad men? That's a great line. Do I lack mad men that you have brought this fellow to behave as a madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? And then chapter 22 of 1 Samuel begins like this. David departed there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. He had a tomorrow. He had a tomorrow in the midst of the fear of today because he said, if God is with me, who can be against me? And that's true of you too. If God is for you, who can be against you? If God is for you, who can be against you? And the answer is no one. Nobody. If God is for us, is our fear too great? No, it's not. Friends, what the world deeply needs right now is for Christians who are confident that God is actually real. And that because he's real, we have a hope for tomorrow. That the experiences of our life today is not all that is true. That if God is for us, then who can be against us? I mean, let me say this again. Anxiety, and depression are globally up 25% in 2.5 years. 25%. There's all kinds of reasons for this. And we could list them. I listed just a few of them for you. But you could add your own list. There's reasons to fear. But if God is for us, who can be against us? God, who did not spare his only Son, but gave him up for us all, how much more will he not give us all things? All things. Lord, we all know that we can name the nights that have been sleepless, that we've tossed and turned, and we're thankful that you can name them too, that they're recorded in your book. God, we can name the many reasons why we have flooded our bed with tears, insults hurled at us, mean things done to us, trampling, enemies, fear, Lord. And yet, Lord, you bottle them up and you count them. Lord, you know them completely. Jesus, you know how the scribes and the Pharisees were looking out, seeking a way to catch you. Lord, you know the experience of making your way to the cross there in the garden, sweating blood, saying, Father, if this could be taken from me, do so, but not my will, but yours be done. Jesus, none of this is lost on you. But it's in those places, Lord, where you show up, where your power is made perfect in our weakness, where your cross, a symbol of torture and pain, is made the symbol of life through the resurrection. God, we pray that in our day, a day where creativity is low because fear is high, that we might be a people of hope because you are with us, because you are among us. Because if you are for us, Lord, who can be against us? In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen.